Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Green Gathering 2011. It's nice to see it back. Yay! Brilliant. My name's Darren Deojee, and I'm doing quite a few events this weekend, but the one tonight is about the People's Public Trust, which most of you will not have a clue what that is at the moment, but hopefully by the end of it you'll see that it's something quite interesting and something valuable that we can all take from and use. I can't really do this talk or this introduction without talking about the Freeman and Sovereign movement in some way, even though we're going to discover that it is a bit of a dead-end street. And for those of you that don't know anything about the Freeman and Sovereign movement, we'll talk about it a bit as we go along. But I want to start tonight talking about a book I read many years ago that I think made a really important point for all of us. And it was a book called When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. And so if everyone thinks about that for a moment, when I say no, I feel guilty. And it was a book about assertiveness. And it was written by a guy who was sent by the American Army to train, not the Army, sorry, maybe he was, but he was sent by the Americans to help train the Peace Corps over in Vietnam. And he had a bit of a problem with the young Americans who went over there, and that is none of them could assert themselves. And he started to explore with them where all this came from. And he started to ask them, you know, where was the contract you signed that said you had to answer a question every time somebody asked it? When somebody asked for your name or your date of birth or where you're going or things like that, where do we get this sense of obligation to give answers or to do what others say? And he found that there was a real problem with these young Americans in feeling any sense of authority and empowerment in their roles or in what they were doing. And I think it's a very relevant point for all of us, and especially those of you who are into your Freeman stuff, you'll be very aware that contract is a big issue. But there was another point that he made in that book that I think is even more important, and he talks about the worst thing that can happen to a species. And he says the worst thing that can happen to a species is that it becomes domesticated. And that is where its offspring are born with their spirits broken and with their desire to explore and be adventurous and be exuberant cracked out of them. And he was commenting back in the late 60s that he was extremely worried that humanity was on the verge of domestication, and absolutely terrified. And I really resonated with that. That meant a lot to me. And I think there's real evidence of this idea of domestication turning up in our cultures, especially in our urban environments, where by the time people have made it through state education, they are indeed domesticated. They're quite cowed. They won't say anything back to authority. They will quite happily answer all questions and fill in all forms without realizing what the implications of those things are. And the Freeman movement, for those of you that don't know anything about it, is very much about understanding what the implications of those things are. It's called the Freeman or Sovereign movement because it recognizes the fact that we are all born free. We're all born with a sovereignty in our consciousness, with a divine mandate and a divine right to be here, to take up our space, to have the right to our opinions and our beliefs and our practices as long as they're not hurting anybody else. And this is really held in essence in our common law. So the common law is something that is spread mainly around, a lot of Europe and North America and the North American continent. And you can sum it up in three basic principles, which is if you're not affecting anybody's liberty, property, or causing injury, then you're not actually committing a crime, because nobody's being harmed. Now, that's an interesting contrast to the situation we find ourselves in, which is where more and more unharmful activities, or unharmful to anybody else anyway, are being criminalized. And this is something which has really been accelerated with the birth of the Criminal Justice Act and other such bill, the Terrorism Act, things like that. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that under the Terrorism Act, the definition of terrorism is any act which seeks to influence government. Now that really deserves a lot of thought, because this is how they're managing to use terrorism legislation against green protesters and, the climate camp and things like that. And people aren't aware that anything that that they construe to influence government can be construed to be terrorism, and it's something that we really have to watch out for, because it's part of, or seems to be part of, an ever-enclosing net which is looking to criminalize people for their everyday activity. The criminalization of it is really all about cash. It's to try and get cash out of people, and we're going to have a look a little bit tonight as to what that's all about, but not too much. But I would invite people to go and watch films such as Money is Debt and other related ones on the whole idea of what economy is and how money works, because it's another part of the illusion that surrounds us, and a very powerful part because of how much people measure their decisions and their actions based on their financial capacity. So it's a very, very powerful thing. Now, can I just get a sort of a show of hands as to how many people are familiar with the whole Freeman or Sovereign movement in any way at all? So most of you, but there's a few that aren't. Okay, I'll go into some of the basic principles just so you've got your head around it. So if we are indeed all born in a state of divine mandate and sovereignty and feeling fully empowered, with an equal right to make decisions as anybody else on the planet, then how is it that we get swept into this hierarchy where we find ourselves at the bottom of the pile? How does this actually happen? Because as this chap who wrote When I Say No, I Feel Guilty says, when did you sign the contract that put you in that position? Because you didn't, did you? Now, the Freeman movement has been very much about researching how it is that the state manages to enforce its statutes upon us, seemingly without our consent. Now, the reality is that upon investigation, that it is actually all consent-based. Our whole system of governance is based on consent, because if it wasn't, it would be slavery. And this is the big question that is being asked now. There's a really interesting thing that the Abolition of Slavery Act has actually been abolished, which I think is quite funny. Well, it's not abolished, it's been repealed as one of the many acts that were being repealed under the guise of the fact that it wasn't needed anymore. But I'm not quite so sure that was the overall motive for it, but we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. Now, one of the major premises of the Freeman and Sovereign movement is that all the things that you normally think of as law are not actually laws. They are things which are given the force of law by a government, and that is all the acts of Parliament. So they're actually called statutes. So you may have heard that term. Has everybody heard it? Yeah? So you hear of statutory authority and statutory this and statutory that. These are all under the guise of being law, but they're not. They are legal. Okay? And the reason we have the different words for legal and lawful is because they're different things. So legal in the world of legality and the world of statutes is one law, which is all under, I suppose you could think of it as a corporate sort of jurisdiction or a corporatized jurisdiction. But then you have the real laws, that are all the ones which don't have act after the title. So things like the Bill of Rights or the Magna Carta, these things just have a year after them. And these are the things which are the true laws which operate on a common law basis. Now, the whole research process on how the state has managed to act upon us as sovereign beings has been going on for a number of years now. Mainly it started off in America and Canada and then moved over to this country. But I think we've got it a bit tougher here, because the Americans and the Canadians have more recent documents like the American Constitution, which recognize their rights and their powers. We don't really have anything like that. The Magna Carta is the closest thing we have, but it doesn't really recognize the sort of power that we're talking about here. But the research has basically taken us to the point of understanding what registration is about. Now, registration is a bit of a tricky thing, and I don't want to get too technical on all the legal stuff, because it's a bit of a black hole, and I do believe that it's a bit of a smokescreen, and that's why I don't think it's worth delving into too much. And I say this from the voice of experience. I've been doing this stuff for a couple of years now, being in and out of courts with people all over the country at various talks and meets, listening to other people and their experiences. And we really are in the belly of the beast here, and we are really up against some of the oldest structures of governance and, I suppose, community control on the planet. So it means we've got our work cut out for us. Now, registration is something that we all take as a normal thing. You register on websites, you register for this, you register for that. But it's actually a term that comes from admiralty, which is a type of law, the law of the sea. And in admiralty, when a captain used to register a ship at the harbour, it would essentially be handing over temporary custodianship to the harbour master, because the captain was going to be off on the land for a while. Now, that hasn't actually changed. When your parents registered you, there wasn't a way handing over temporary custodianship or inviting an element of custodianship to the state over you. And this is where the power of the state to come and take children from their parents, or to demand that you go to school, or to demand that you have to do X, Y, and Z, or try to get you to have certain vaccines. It's all actually done off the back of the registration document. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later when we get onto the subject of title. Now, the final element that you really need to get in terms of understanding the free man movement, just as a skeleton for us to move forward onto the real meat of tonight's talk, is the idea of what's called the legal fiction or the legal person. Now, the legal person is the Mr., the Mrs., or the Miss. It's the title that was given to you. So it's that name that you see that appears in all capitals on envelopes or documents that come through. That is referring to essentially a fictitious entity. It's not actually referring to you, the real human being, because in truth the state can't actually act upon you, the real human being. They can only act upon this fictitious entity. And I would invite you to go and maybe do an internet search on the concept of the legal fiction or the person, because it's quite convoluted but also quite empowering to have a look at. And the intention tonight isn't to reinvent the wheel or to repeat what countless others have done before me. So if you just maybe want to make a note in your head to research the legal fiction or the legal person, it will give you a bit of an idea. But yes?
Meet Your Straw Man is an excellent 10-minute YouTube video by TPUC that does the whole job.
Thank you. Meet Your Straw Man on tpuc.org. So that's a 10-minute film that can tell you a bit more about it and put it on in a nutshell. Now, what happened when people were first trying to enact or use the concepts of the free man movement, which is, wait a minute, you don't have my consent to enforce these statutes upon me because there's no victim here when I'm doing whatever it is I'm doing. There's a number of things that people have been trying it with. But when they were going into court, they were using terms like, oh, that name isn't me, that's the legal fiction, or it's a corporation, or whatever. And I would go into court with these people and just watch the heads spin in the room. Nobody in the court knew what these people were talking about. And it was because the free men had invented a word for a concept that they understood, but they hadn't told anybody else about it. And what you ended up having was a lot of free men standing there going, well, I'm a free man and this is what I believe and blah, 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 you can't tell me what to do. And then you had all these policemen and court staff standing there saying, well, we're the state and we do things like this and we've been doing it for a few hundred years and, well, you know that really. What you had was two people really just spouting their positions. Now the problem is when you've got two people spouting their positions and one is authorised to use force and the other isn't, then it's pretty much a clear-cut situation as to what's going to happen, and that's exactly what's been happening over the last few years to a lot of people in this movement, is they've been getting dragged away by force, which obviously isn't a very good position to be in. No, exactly. Has anybody here been in a situation where they've been hauled off by force against their will? A few, yeah. It's not a very nice situation to be in, is it? So I was looking at all of this and thinking, this is no good. Because in all the work that I do, and because the rest of the work I do is completely unrelated to this, but what got me interested in it was the language that was being used and the empowerment that people were feeling. And so as I started to delve into it, I started to have a look at the language involved. And I looked at title. And what was interesting about title is that none of the titles that you're aware of that you got from the States, so Mr., Mrs., Miss, these are not in any legal dictionary. And not in any of the ones that I've looked at anyway. And so I delved a bit further, and what was interesting is that the word mystery is. So that's mystery, M-I-S-T-E-R-Y. And archaically, it used to be spelled mystery, as in, it's a mystery, M-Y-S-T-E-R-Y. And the definition in a well-known legal dictionary, which is called Black's, which is used a lot in America, less so over here. But in Black's 8th edition, for those of you that want to check it, the definition of mystery is 4 words. A business, comma, a trade. Okay, a business, comma, a trade. So a mister is that which is engaged in mystery. So the mister title is actually what makes you into a business in the state's eyes. Now, when we start to look at Mrs., it's pretty interesting because, like I said, the language is what interested me, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, MERS. MERS. Why do we say Mrs.? MERS. It's not even a word. And I realised it's actually missing an apostrophe. It's misters. It's belonging to the business. So you have Mr. the business and Misters, or abbreviated to Mrs., which is belonging to the business. But then if we look at Miss, the final sort of state-given title, I want you all to picture a form. Many of you have filled them in over the years, and it's got title, forename, surname. Yeah? Everybody knows? Under title, if you write Miss, it means miss this, skip this. Miss means no title. So when women were looking for their rights, the right to vote and the right to work and all the rest of it, title never caught up. They didn't actually get the business title. So when they used to talk about it being a man's world and the business world being a man's world and all the rest of it, they were absolutely right. Title had never been given to them in that arena. Now, what's quite an interesting thing is that there's a guy called Bill Thornton in America who does a lot about standing as the people rather than as a citizen. Now, what's a very interesting thing is that the people, the flesh and blood beings, hire and elect governments to administer their nation. Yeah? So the people are actually above a government. But citizens and corporations and businesses are below a government in a hierarchy, because a government has to be able to tell them what to do and to control their behaviour to make sure they don't harm the people. This is why all companies and all corporations and all the rest of it must have public liability insurance, because they're a liability to real people. But essentially, what the state is, it's true though, essentially what the state has done is by corporatizing you and I with their title, by turning us into businesses or assets of the business, it's allowed them to set us below them in the hierarchy rather than above, which is what allows them to tell us what to do, to drag us off and all the rest of it. So a lot of the work of what people like Bill and Thornton and stuff are doing is to restore the standing as being one of the people rather than a citizen. Now the title citizen didn't exist before the abolition of slavery in America. And what happened in the States was that they were looking at freeing all the slaves, but at the top end of the hierarchy they were looking and thinking, well, we don't want these slaves to have all the rights of the people in the Constitution. What are we going to do? And so they invented the classification of citizen. And so the people that were around at the time would remain the people, but any freed slaves could only become citizens at the time. Now the concept of citizenship in that respect, where a citizen is below government, so it's quite actually clearly defined both in America and here, that a government gives or prefers rights and responsibilities and duties to the citizen, whereas the people are the ones who give the rights, the responsibilities and the duties to the government. But what they've done is they have removed their capacity to stand as the people, and they've done it through title. And this is why I think, the free man movement, for those of you that have looked into it, I really did sit and think it through. I went through a lot of the processes with people, and it is a dead-end street. And I'll just tell you why for a moment. If you imagined right here, right now, everybody was a free man and nobody was liable for taxes and duties and going to work and all these sorts of things. They could all live freely to their vacation and did what they wanted to do. Then what do you think would happen? There would be a short period of milling about probably, maybe some elements of anarchic behaviour in various places. But at some point or another, people would eventually take responsibility for various things around them, like sections of road, or the library that's been abandoned, or the swimming pool, or whatever. And they would then start to run it privately. And of course, they should be recompensed for that. There should be an exchange there. And then what you would see is what I would consider to be Tory heaven, isn't it? Everything privately owned and privately charged for and all the rest of it. And when you tell most free men that actually their ideology is Tory heaven, it tends to make them sit up and think about it for a moment, because the free man attitude is one where when people have a first awakening where they realise they've been deceived or they realise they've been oppressed, they're generally not that happy about it. They get a bit upset. And the free man movement is quite a reflection of that, where it's like, oh, I want nothing to do with you, you're all a bunch of corrupt, deceiving swines, get away, don't darken my doorstep ever again. And I think that's just the initial gut response that people seem to have, because the problem with people doing that is that nothing changes. We all just run to the hills, and then it's like, well, how long do we have? How long have we got in our little hill communities before they come and try and kick us off? And certainly those of you that have been trying to get involved in off-grid communities in this country will soon come across the issue that it's not that simple. Because they will come looking for you under planning rules, under regs or whatever. They might give you permission for a couple of years to live on your land, but then not. And this is all because of the power of statute. So there's major issues that we need to tackle here. And as I continued to think the process through, I realised, of course, that the titles I mentioned aren't the only titles that we've ever had. And the other titles that we had aren't in any statute, any law. They are buried in our culture. They're buried in our consciousness because they can't be removed. Now, sadly, I'm only going to have to speak to the gentleman for a few minutes, but ladies will come back to you shortly. And that is, guys, before you had the title given to you by the state, you had another title. And when you had it, you were not subject to statute. You were only subject to the common law, so you only got into trouble if you actually harmed somebody. But if you were maybe off having a little bit of fun with your friends or whatever, there was nothing they could do to you about it, and you were told it was because you were a minor. That is a lot of rubbish. The title I'm referring to is, of course, the title Master. And I invite you all to look in any legal dictionary in anywhere in the world and try to find one that mentions being under 16. Because I'll guarantee you right now there isn't one. Yeah? You have a look and consider what the title Master means. Now, we'll get onto the other connotations of it later, but in terms of legally speaking, those of you that have done a bit of research or into the free man movement in any way, these definitions should be of great interest to you. So the first definition in blacks of a master is always a principal, but a principal is not always a master. Now, I'll translate that for you. A principal is a creditor. Okay, a principal is the one who puts the money on the table. Now, what the state have done to us is they've turned us all into the debtors. But we're not the debtors, that's the point. We're the ones who have been made liable for other people's decisions. So when you hear the term the national debt, it's not actually the national debt, it's the national credit. And it is not the government's credit. This is something people have to try and understand, is that, the government and the corporate bodies and things like that, they cannot actually borrow money because they can't pay things back. Because they're not real. They're just buildings and people and bits of paper. They're not real things. Anything that involves a transaction of credit or the exchange of money requires a signature. It requires a human being to put themselves on the line in some way. Now, what's happened in terms of the state and the national credit is that it is your credit that is extended. It's in your name. When you hear about us talking about people going to war in your name and people being killed in your name and all the rest of it, it's not just that. It's the debt is in your name. But it's not just in your name, it's actually yours. It's your credit that they have had extended and then spent, supposedly representing your position. And I invite you all to consider now decisions made in recent years actually are representative of your position or not. Because this is exactly what the People's Public Trust is about, which we'll get onto in a bit, which is about dealing with the fact that it's not actually representative of anybody I know anyway. If anybody knows somebody who it does represent, please let me know. I'd like to shake their hand and celebrate the fact they actually got represented. Yeah, like, well done. Excuse me a moment. So it's a very, very significant thing that the master title recognises the fact that we are the principal creditors in the nation. And it's because we're the only thing which can create wealth, or to create things which have wealth, through our creativity, through our craftsmanship and things like that. These are the things which actually have value. Nothing else does in the corporate world. Now, I need to broaden that sort of thing out a bit, to that aspect out a bit, for some of you to understand why that would be the case. Why is it that money is being borrowed in your name and then you're being held liable for it? And it's all because the nation's bankrupt. All the Western countries are actually bankrupt. Is that news to anybody? Does everybody know that?
Surely not. Be bankrupt.
We're the United Kingdom. We've got a queen and everything. No, we are most definitely bankrupt, and we have been. I think it's from the First Crusade. From around the time of the First Crusade, about the 11th or 12th century, we've been bankrupt since then, because the king bought, I think it was the Austro-Hungarian sort of merchant cartel at the time, were very into lending to royalty and letting them spend it because they knew they could get it back. Now, the first, sorry?
That is basic invention of tally sticks.
Okay.
They were actually asked to leave the country by, I think it was Henry the First after. And we bought in tally sticks for about 700 years, but I think bankruptcy was actually declared in about 1839.
Was it? Gotcha.
We're actually using bits of wood.
Yeah. More valuable to most of us than bits of paper, aren't they? At least you can do something with wood. Yeah. Thanks for that, though. Yeah. So the interesting thing is that distinction you made there, the bankruptcy in the 1800s, that was the second bankruptcy, possibly the third. The nation has been multiple times, and each time the assets have reduced. So the first bankruptcy, I believe, was actually over gold and silver. And so when all the gold and silver was gone, we were bankrupt. So the lenders turned around and said, well, okay, what have you got? If you've not got gold or silver, what have you got? They said, well, we've got all this land. Brilliant. You can borrow against your land. And I do believe that this is actually what gave rise to the absolute land grab by the Spanish and British empires, was to go and get as much land as they could so that they could borrow against it. But then, as Nolan pointed out, they got bankrupted again. So then when they started to go for credit, it's like, well, what have you got? You've not got any land, you've not got any bloody money, you know, what have you got? Oh, we've got all these people. All these people, they can all work, they can all produce stuff, and they can make money during their life. Brilliant. That's a genius idea. Okay, we'll lend against your people then. And this is really around the time that I believe, you know, not just registration, but the application of what registration meant for children in terms of extending the credit of the people. That's when that sort of kicked off. And that's the situation we're in just now, is that we're still using the people as the asset and as the debtor. So it's not a very healthy situation for us to be in, because the situation the government is in at the moment, and all its representatives and all the local authorities, is that they've got a heck of a lot of interest to pay off because of silly decision makers, and there's only one bunch of people they can get it off, and that's us. And this is why there's increasing means of getting money off you. No matter which way you look, there's various ways, you know, they'll get money off you for parking if they can, they'll get money off you for parking in the wrong place, they'll get money off you for anything, basically. And if you stick your head up for one thing and you don't toe the line, then they just escalate it because they'll try and get as much as they can off anybody, because actually they have to. They're trying to settle the debt, you know. The fact that the debt doesn't exist and it's not real, that hasn't sunk in to the state processes yet. You know, I do invite anybody to think, if anybody believes they lost anything during the recent financial crashes, I want you to point to me, please, where the mass burning of £50 notes was, or where was the mass melting of gold and its alchemization into something else, because none of that wealth actually existed. It was all numbers on a screen. It wasn't real. And it's been like that for a very, very long time. I think all this stuff that's going on just now is very good, because it's helping free up our fixation to these things. But it leaves us in a bit of a sticky spot in relation to the state, because we are in this position where, as far as they're concerned, they're doing what we asked them to do, which is to administer the nation and to settle the debts appropriately and all this sort of stuff. And we're on the rough end of the stick at the moment. So the use of the master title can be partly to do with us re-establishing ourselves as the creditors of the nation. And nobody can stop you taking that title, guys. It's yours. And it's just about you. You don't have to reclaim it. You just have to start reusing it, because nobody took it off you. Now, ladies, that puts you in a bit of a position, doesn't it? Because what would your title be? Now, I've had many ladies come up to me after talks, and some of them want to use mistress and some of them want to use master, and they ask for my opinion, and I don't have one. Because I am no way going to be yet another guy that tries to tell women what to refer to themselves as or what to call themselves or whatever. Ladies, it's completely up to you. You know, what I would say, though, is just a word of my only comment on it is that the title master is asexual, legally speaking, and also it has a precedent, it has a history, whereas something like the word mistress, I'm not sure if the same precedent and merit is there. And we'll just look at the other side of the coin for a moment. The other side of the coin is that if the people are the master, who are the servants? Well, they're the public servants, because that's what they're called. The civil servants, the hint's in the title, the hint's in the name. And all the while, they've been calling themselves public servants and civil servants, but everybody's forgotten who the master was. So in that respect, ladies, in relation to public servants and civil servants, you're still the master, but it's up to you whether you want to use that title or not. Now, the second definition or one of the later definitions in Black's for what the master is or who the master is for those of you that are interested in all the admiralty jurisdiction stuff, one of the definitions is a master is captain of his vessel, or her. Captain of his vessel. So in terms of us talking about that whole registration thing and about the fact that some of you will have to go and look into this, but most of the law that's applied in the country is actually Admiralty jurisdiction. It's the law of the sea because it allows it to be branched out internationally. So master as being captain of your vessel is a very, very empowering position to be in, because it suddenly means the captain of the ship is back, which is quite a thing if it's applied properly. And the rest of the definitions kind of go on as you might expect. There's another one that's quite interesting though, and it's the one that's most relevant to what I want to talk about tonight, and that is that a master is one who employs another for services and has control over the conduct of that other. Now that's where we've tripped up, because we employ others for the conduct of services, but we've lost control over the conduct. They're telling us what to do and how to behave rather than the other way around. Now this is where Rob Menard, one of the first videos most people come across, a chap who's very good at putting across the idea of the legal person. His idea or his understanding of what statutes and that body of law, as it was, the whole legal category, his understanding of that was that actually that was to apply to corporations to make sure that you could expect a standard from them when they were serving. And I really quite like that, because it then would mean obviously things like, you know, you could be guaranteed that you could be ensured that your public servants or your companies aren't going to be smoking marijuana or drinking too much alcohol on the job or committing acts of violence or things like that. So that's actually quite a useful flipping of the tables. And I think it's something that's extremely relevant to us now. So as I said earlier, the free man movement, most people initially kind of used it as a washing their hands of the system. But I think we've got a bloody good infrastructure in this country. I've worked at central and local government level all over the country, and it's a good infrastructure. Your bins generally disappear, you know, the rubbish gets taken, the roads are generally clear of giant holes and whatnot. There's swimming pools and schools available for people, and libraries. I don't use most of those things, but if people want to use them, I think it's a good thing that they're there. The problem that we've got is it's just a few bad apples in the bunch. So rather than washing our hands of the whole thing, I think what I've been doing for the last year or so with some of my colleagues is about us reclaiming the title master in relation to public servants, but also seeking to apply the power of that title to try and remind them that their conduct is falling below the expected standards of a community. Now, it's a bit tricky before we go into all the public trust stuff as to why we formed it, because we're going to have a look at some other bodies of law for a moment. So if everyone can bear with me for a second, we'll delve a bit more into the whole law thing. So the free man movement is very much about how everything is a contract. So when you have a look at what everybody's doing out there in the free man sovereign movement, it's very much about saying, well, where's the contract? People are writing on envelopes, no contract, return to sender, and sticking them back in the post. Or if they're addressed to the occupier, they're sending them to the Israeli embassy. And I think that's quite a useful thing to do. I think that's quite entertaining. So, yeah. So if anything comes in for the occupier, remember, that's not your name. It's not addressed to you. So send it to the Israeli embassy. I think it's a brilliant idea. Excuse me another moment. But what's interesting is that everything is about contract these days, isn't it? People have a contract for their job. You're going to have a contract between companies. There's contracts of service. And even now, our public services have been contracted out. There's been under the guise of privatisation, but folks, that is an absolute smokescreen. Nothing has been truly privatised. It's all contracted. That's why it can be changed at any time. You know, contractors can change who are providing the service. It still is actually all owned by the people, and anything can be republicised at any time, you know, made public again. But contract law isn't the only law. There's older laws, so common law is one that I've mentioned already, but there's another body of law that's very interesting, which is very relevant in relation to us trying to get our empowerment back in relation to public servants. Because the reason we're struggling to get our public servants to do what they should be doing is because of a very tricksy corporate thing called limited liability. Now, this is where everybody can hide behind their job, basically. So people can hide behind their job, they can hide behind the filing cabinet, they can hide behind the corporate face because of limited liability. Now, limited liability is really a position of diminished responsibility. Okay, it's diminished responsibility. That's not a good thing. for human beings to have. Nobody should have diminished responsibility because it opens the doors to allow them to do all sorts of stuff and not be responsible for it. And actually, for the last couple of years, I have been writing to companies reminding them that diminished responsibility used to only be granted to children and the mentally unwell. And I would ask them, which are you? You know, which are you to allow you to get this status? But what it does mean is that when you are trying to go after particular public servants for basically their lack of service and falling below the standards, they can hide behind a limited liability and not take responsibility. However, the body that lies under contract law, or one of the bodies of law, is what's called trust law. Now, trust law is what actually stood between common law and contract law coming in. And trust law is very, very, very interesting because it's really simple. And really, trust, and I invite everyone to think of it, that trust law has actually arisen on the back of the concept of trust. So you just think about the concept of trust and how important it is in all your relationships, how important it is right here and right now that you trust other people in the field not to be in your camper or in your tent raking around or whatever. Trust is the absolute fundamental factor in any human community. Okay, without trust you have no reliability, you have no certainty, you can't take your eyes off anything basically because you can't trust anybody. And trust law is really an attempt to embody that idea where other people would be entrusted with your assets while you use them. But trust is more than that because it's about recognizing that when people would take on positions of responsibility, the trust element was first. Okay, before any contract, trust came first. So you were trusted to do a job ever before you were given a contract to sign. Yeah, does everybody get that concept? Yep. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about trusts is that they are at play all the time. Okay, right now I could say, Nick, can you take this pen and give it to John, please? As soon as he accepts it, a trust is created. He's the trustee, I'm the grantor, and John's the beneficiary. And this relationship is something that's really simple, but it's actually really important for all of us if we want to understand how we can start to protect ourselves and our families from the increasing sort of situations that are arising around us. So a trust can be that simple. And our public servants all have a position of trust first. Now, there's a really handy thing in trust law, and that is that say I said to Nick, I'm giving you this pen, I'm trusting you with this pen to give it to John, yeah? That's an expressed trust, because I've told him it's a trust that we've created. However, if I just gave it to him and said, give it to John, please, yeah? I've not declared the fact that there was a trust there, but it is implied, and it's construable. Now, these are two legal terms that stand very strongly in trust courts. Now, it's easy to imply and construe that our public servants have a position of trust. Now, the great thing is, if you declare it, then you can move them out of contract law into trust law. And in trust law, there is no limited liability. Everybody is personally liable, personally, for their actions and for what they've done. Now, what happens when people are trying to take public servants to court at the moment is that the courts will try and make everything statutory, because it means that they can keep the liability away from the individuals and let the corporate face take it. And what that means is nothing changes. The obnoxiousness and the unhelpfulness increases. We have to be able to get through that, and this is what the People's Public Trust is about. So the People's Public Trust, the name is telling you what it's for. So the first one is about the people, so it's about us redefining the fact that we are standing as the people and not as citizens. The fact that it's public is because there's a bit of a tricksy thing about the whole public and private powers thing, but it's called public because it's actually a private vessel, for those of you that are into your Admiralty, so it's a bit of a play on words. And then obviously it's about the trust. So what the People's Public Trust is doing is expressing the fact that every single public servant is entrusted with having the well-being of the community as their highest personal priority. And if it's not that, then inviting them to say, well, okay, what is the position of public servant then? What is meant to be your highest personal priority? Please do share, because then at least we'll know where we stand. So by expressing that trust, what's great about it is it puts the public servants in the position of, first of all, saying that that's not what they were entrusted with, and second of all, of then I forgot what my second point was there. I can't remember. Okay, the first point is that you know, they're trusted with that as being their highest priority. So what we're doing with the People's Public Trust is saying that we are working to fix the public service by dealing with one public servant at a time. And we're working to work with public servants to achieve that. Because, like I said, I've worked in public service around this country. I've served in Parliament and at over 70 councils, and I can tell you there's a lot of good public servants out there. And they really do love serving the people, and they really do recognise that they are one of the people. And positive state of affairs, and many of you will encounter these people, sometimes at the council, sometimes in policemen, or sometimes whatever. There's thousands of great servers out there. And the People's Public Trust is looking to win them on side because they're the ones who really know who the bad guys are. They're the ones who really know who the immature, untrustworthy ones are. And really, we can't actually reclaim the power of the people without their help. Because we're all one community, they are our community as well. You know, we're all in the same community together. But it's very much about reminding them of that. So I have this bit of a trick. Like I said to you before, the whole reason I got into this movement is because of the language involved. And long before I knew anything about Freeman, I was doing stuff about the enslavement of humanity and about the corporate control of people, and how it's staring us in the face that you don't have to dredge up complicated conspiracy theories to try and paint the picture to people and then have all your intelligent, well-read friends saying, oh, well, you know, that's all a bit conspiratorial. You know, where's the actual clear, hard evidence? So I'll give you a few examples just now. I want you to think about your average man going to work in the city. Say he was going to work in a bank or an office or something like that. And I want you to think about what he would wear. So I want you to picture it in your mind. I'm obviously talking about the suit or the uniform. No, mainly the suit, though. Now, we're going to look at the elements of what the suit's made up of. So can you tell me, please, what this part's called here? I have to reach under my hair. What's this part? It's a collar. What's the part round the wrist called? Cuffs. Yeah? And what's the part round the neck? It's a tie. Okay, this is where we've been tricked by context, folks. This is called foolery by context. So just think for a moment, who else wears collar, cuffs and a tie? Prisoners or slaves. And we have different grades of collar worker. You've got blue collar, white collar, dog collar. All your police are known by their collar number. And even Bush and Blair have to wear a collar to go to work. There's certain places you can't get into unless you're collared. And I'm just going to pause for a moment there and let you think about that. Because those are very, very powerful symbols.
One symbol that happens for people who rebel is they don't wear ties or collars.
It's very common, isn't it? Absolutely. It's intuitive.
Yeah, you just don't wear ties and collars.
Yeah.
You don't want to wear them.
You don't want to wear them. It's intuitive. The thing that gets me, though, is how could we have forgotten? How could we not have spotted it? Every one of us grew up in that environment, surrounded by them. And we missed it. Staring us in the face. Same as the Master and Mr. stuff and all the rest of it. But the collar cuffs tie is very significant. And I mean, like I said, the language stuff is really my core work, and it's about how we don't need to go dredging up old traditions or importing, you know, spiritualities and traditions from other countries because we believe ours is so corrupt. Actually, ours is an immensely spiritual tradition over here in the West. It's just distorted because we're all looking in the wrong place. The real keys to our freedom really are staring us in the face, and that's one tiny example. And I just use it because it's one that everybody gets. But there's tons of examples. I mean, I'll give you another one about the whole enslavement and trickery idea, and that is, I want you to picture your average supermarket that we've all gone into at some point in our lives. And there's a sign above the door that we usually take to mean way in. You know, it's the way in. What does that sign actually say, please, folks? Entrance, okay. So I want you to look at the phonetics of entrance and then look at the word. This is where we're tricked by emphasis, okay, because the word isn't entrance. What is the word? It's entrance. That's right, it is entrance. Now I want you to picture what happens in your average Tesco or Sainsbury's or whatever, and just pause and meditate and visualize and picture your own behaviour and the behaviour of others while they're in there. You've got the bright shiny lights shining on these wonderfully packaged products which promise allure or satisfaction or full bellies or a smiley face or being attractive to the opposite sex. And you've got the lovely music playing in the background, plinky plonky plink, oh brilliant, yeah, buy one get one free, fab, do. And we are all entranced by it all. And it's because over countless years many, many clever people have got together to piece all this together. It makes it very, very difficult for us to break free from it. But again, entrance has been staring us in the face our whole lives. And I'll tell you what, if you look at the etymology of entrance, the word, not that I'm that bothered about etymology, but I don't think you'll ever find in English that there's nothing that ever said way in originally. Entrance was always entrance, and it still is. Excuse me a moment, get a bit dry here. Okay, so what I use in terms of our public servants, and for anybody who has to wear a collar for work, is not to get too worked up about it. If you want to get up on, you know, if you're really interested in where that whole language tunnel goes, then come and see me later. You know, come to some of the other events that are going on this weekend where I'll be going right into some of the other language stuff. The only reason I mention it in relation to this particular talk is because it's a reminder that if you've got your collar on, then you're serving. When you take it off, you're back to being one of the people again. And this is where I'm trying to be inclusive with the People's Public Trust, with our public servants. It's like, no, when you've got your collar on, you're serving, mate. You know, when you take it off, you're back being one of the public masters again. And this is a way where we have this symbiotic beneficial relationship going on, where we're all benefiting from the services, but it would be nice if they had an element of humanity still. You know, so it's I'm very much about rehumanizing our services, because I think if we can achieve that, then actually a lot of the other problems will just disappear. Because all of a sudden you will have representatives who will represent the fact that we're vulnerable and fragile beings, and that we really do need safe communities, and we really do need progressive and creative and healthy education. And these are very much the hallmark terms of what we're promoting the People's Public Trust is standing for. Because it is what we stand for, because doesn't everybody want that? Do you want a safe community? Yeah? Good, happy education for your kids? Yeah? I think we want that, and so really we're asking that of public servants, and then saying, well, if you don't want that, should you really be a public servant? Should you really be in a public-facing role? And so we're really trying to pitch ourselves as being an intermediary, as being somebody who can stand there and help councils to deal with problem employees or problem relationships or problem interactions they have in the community, because us and them is never going to do it. As long as we get this, keep this us and them going on, with both sides fomenting it and polarizing it and making it trickier, then how on earth are we ever going to manage to live as one community? I mean, you know, not everybody does want to live in off-grid communities like some of us do. Some do enjoy living in the urban space, and that's fine. We're still one community, because we're all sharing the same land, aren't we? We're all breathing the same air, we're all drinking the same water. And as long as some of us are damaging all of those things or charging for those things, then it's not a healthy state of affairs. And again, hopefully the idea behind the People's Public Trust is that with enough support, we can start to take what's called representative action against public servants who are misrepresenting us, and start to weed them out. Because if we can weed those ones out, I tell you what, I genuinely don't believe we need to win many cases before we would see a mass change in behaviour. Because the only reason people are behaving the way that they are in public services is because they can get away with it. And because they're seeing the ones high up getting away with it, so they're thinking, well, why the bloody hell should I give a humane service? Because they're feeling just as oppressed when they're at home. They're struggling to pay their bills. They're feeling just as done in by it all. So what we're really trying to do is win over public servants, but not just public servants, to get, obviously, as many people on board as possible, because we can go after small fish with just a few names. But if we want to go after some big fish, which we can't do it without a lot of names. Remember, war is done in your name. Okay, all it takes is the use of your name, and we can go and start to take some big cases, which would be very good. And I just want to mention, to show how powerful that can potentially be, I want to mention Iceland for a moment. So, Iceland, you don't hear a lot about Iceland in the news anymore, do you? It kind of disappeared after they had their economic collapse. Well, I'll tell you why you don't hear much about it. After their economic collapse, their government collapsed as well. Iceland were one of the last that got scammed into the whole big lending, big borrowing thing. And when their government collapsed, the new government stood up and said, actually, the Icelandic people will not accept liability for your private debts. Bugger off. They maybe didn't say bugger off, but I'm sure that was the spirit of it. So the Icelandic people will not accept that liability. And the reaction was, Britain and Japan were instrumental in sanctioning Iceland, because they had supposedly invested all this people's money. They hadn't invested it. You know, it wasn't actual cash that had been invested. It was all to do with trying to tie Iceland up and bind it into the whole World Bank scam. But they sanctioned them to the point where there was people on the streets you know, with placards because they had no food, they had no bread, there was no clothes coming into the country. They were being absolutely hammered by the West for turning around and giving two fingers to the banks. Now, if they can do it, so can we. Now, you might be thinking, well, you know, because obviously our representatives turned around and said, oh, the British people would love to take liability for your debts. So would their children. Please do come along, we'll sign them up. And this is exactly the situation that we've put in now, where I think the liability at the last bailout was 30,000 for every household in the UK, or something like that, and that's on top of all the other liability and debts. A couple of months ago, I think I read that the interest of the national debt, I don't know if it's a whole portion, was 150 million a day. So they're having to scratch together 150 million a day just to pay the interest, and that's before they can spend anything on services. So if you're wondering where the cuts are coming from, it's from that. It's from the fact that they've got to start paying out some of these dividends and some of these paybacks. Now, as an aside, Japan and America have no longer accepted jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. They turned around and they said, well, actually, we no longer agree with what those representatives said, so actually, sod off, we're having nothing to do with it. And that would be exactly the same as us turning around and saying, actually, those representatives, that was nothing to do with us. They were obviously bonkers, and we're not going to adhere to that at all. And overnight, it can be undone with appropriate representative action. Now, the representative action, I've mentioned the trust side of it. There's more to it than that, because we can go after people for misconduct, which is a very interesting old common law offence. So for those of you that are, I mean, the biggest problem people have had when going into a court is trying to get the common law enforced, you know, to have a common law jurisdiction, because that's what we're supposed to have here. There's an easy way around it, and that is only choose charges which are only common law. It's that simple. Now, fortunately, there are a few of them left. Most old common law charges have been replaced with a statute, which means that a court will always try and use a statute first, which then has limitations on it. However, if a charge isn't in statutory jurisdiction, if it's only a common law charge, then it can only be heard in the common law. And then all these battles all these free men have been fighting, it's much easier. You know, you don't need to go through that hurdle, just pick the appropriate charge. So the charges we've stumbled across, and one is an absolute beauty, it's called misconduct in public office. What a great charge. It's a serious offence, up to 25 years in jail and an unlimited fine. What's interesting about misconduct in public office is that it is either for doing things or not doing things. So most statutes that you know of are for one or the other. It's for either doing something or not doing something. It's never both. So for us to have, so the case law for misconduct in public office is things like when a policeman did this, but also when he did not do that. Yeah? And it's basically a very useful tool for us, and we're actually preparing our first misconduct in public office charges to take against some down in Hertfordshire, which is actually going through just now. The paperwork's being drawn up as we speak, and hopefully we'll be able to use that to then go after some bigger fish. Sorry, Nick, was your hand up to ask a question?
Yeah, what's the definition of somebody who's in public office?
This is very interesting. It's very interesting you say that. There was, so did everybody hear that? He said, what's the definition of somebody who's in public office? I don't know which body it is. One of the lawmaking advisory bodies to the government published a paper 2 years ago trying to replace misconduct in public office with a statute. They're actually trying to do it just now because of exactly that problem. And what they're saying is that, you know, it's quite a large consultation paper, but it makes an interesting read, and it's talking about how, where does the line of public office get drawn now when so much is privatised? You know, if you have, so we've had a number of cases where a person has been arrested, so that's by an oathed and collared constable, okay? So first of all, they've taken an oath of office, which means they're an entrusted public servant, and second of all, they're collared, which is meant to be a useful thing. Interestingly, though, policemen don't wear cuffs, they carry them, which is a funny little quirk. But what then happens at a lot of police stations is they then hand you over to G4S. So G4S then handle people in the cells and transport them. G4S are unoathed. And I'm not sure whether they're collared. I imagine they are. They're certainly contracted. But G4S are private security. So there you are, thinking you're surrendering yourself, or maybe not surrendering yourself, maybe being hauled off by an oathed and collared servant of yours. But then they hand you over to unoathed, private police, basically, who are not bound by the same rules, or seemingly aren't. And this is where the whole issue of the definition of public office comes in. So I think we need to get in there early and tell them what we think public office is. And public office is, well, so my idea with this, we haven't actually published a definition of this for our work yet, but I believe it needs to be extended to corporate bodies as well. Because, you know, it's a public service most of them are providing. They are in public, they are a liability, all the rest of it, so my line would be drawn around the collar. You know, any establishments where you're required to wear like that for work, then that's public office. That then allows us to use trust and common law jurisdiction against any company, which would be very useful. And actually, yeah, sorry, you're going to say something? No, I just want to, how are we doing for time? Almost an hour. So that means it's almost 10, is it?
It's 55 minutes currently.
Okay, so I'll wrap up soon so the next speaker can get on. I've not talked that much about the trust yet, but anyway, I can give you the website for that later. I want to, you know, there's a really, really important thing that's a bit tricksy again that I'd like you all to get your head around, and it is the difference between private and public. It's a very, very important thing. You know, when you see private property keep out, things like that, this is private, what's going on here, this is a private conversation, stay out sort of thing. Yeah? This meaning of what private is in relation to our activity in our life has been blurred. Okay? So private now means business, doesn't it? You talk about private business, private companies, and then public is governments and things like that. And what have we become? We've become non-entities, or we're on the business side, which is effectively public. So what we actually know of as private power has effectively disappeared for us peons at the bottom of the ladder. Now, there's a reason for that, and that is that people were using trusts and private law and realizing, you know, all the wealthy families are doing it, and they've been doing it for centuries, and they have learned that it's absolutely great. I think it was Rockefeller who said, own nothing, control everything. And that is actually the definition of a trust. A trust is when actually you don't own it. The trust owns it, but you have use of it. Yeah, but it means it can't be taken off you. This is how you hear about all these wealthy people who are involved in a crime or a pension scam or something like that, but they're still driving around in their Ferrari the next day. And that's because it was trust. It doesn't belong to them. It was trust property. But anyway, this is my personal opinion, and it's not, you know, backed up by any specific research, but it's just through my experience and observations over the last few years. I think the crux of the biggest issue we face is the shifting of the line of what private means. So so I'll use court as an example just so people can understand private and public. So we as private people, we always deal in assets, okay? So we will, you know, you might make tables, you might make chairs, and you might swap them. You know, it's a private transaction, and really banks and governments aren't interested. You won't get taxed on that. They're not even interested in attempting to do so because it is recognized as still being private. However, as soon as you introduce cash into that, that's actually a third party in your agreement. It's Bank of England or Clydesdale Bank or Bank of Scotland or whoever, and they're then saying, oh, then it's not private anymore. Now, when you go into court, so those of you who have tried the Freeman route of being Bob of the family Smith or, you know, Amanda of the family Anderson or whatever, people have gone in thinking that any successes that they've had have been because they were using a Freeman method or a Freeman approach, and I don't actually think that's the case at all. I think the success has been because they've gone in untitled, which means that they're invisible, okay? So let's go back to the example of the table and chairs for a moment. If in that table and chairs relationship you were, you know, there's a disagreement, you didn't get enough chairs for the table, and so you had to go to court to get it sorted out, you're not going to drag the tables and chairs into the courtroom. The court don't want to see them, they're not interested. What they want to know is, what's the value? Okay, what's the value here? Oh, okay, you give them a table worth 400 quid, but they only gave you 9 chairs worth 40 quid each. You are indeed due another chair. But they do it based on the money side of it, yeah? So, well, as soon as you go into that public arena, you don't deal in assets anymore. Okay, you're not dealing in real things, flesh and blood, objects, things like that. They can't deal with that in there. And it's because it is too difficult. And I actually respect that. I can see why the laws had to do that, because it's like, how do we quantify this? You know, it's very, very difficult to measure one person's craftsmanship and then against another. Who'd want to step in and do that? Nobody. Now, so this is where you get this idea of cash values and all the rest of it. However, when property is big enough, it has a title. So when you have your home or whatever, you get the title deed, don't you? And if you're having to go to court about your house, you don't drag the house in, do you? you take the title. The title goes in with you, because they're only interested in the title. But then let's spin that back and look at us again. So when we're going in there, really it should be about our title, not our lack of it. You know, if you're going in there with a lack of a title, then you're going in as an asset, basically, and you can't be seen. You go in there with a title, all of a sudden, you're visible, sort of thing. Now, so the private-public thing is a bit sort of tricksy. However, when it comes down to the activities of the people here, so I think the biggest issue at events like this is to do with access to land and land use, and certainly the People's Public Trust, all the cases that we're choosing to get involved in are all about access to land and land use, because I think it's probably one of the most important issues any of us face. It's one of the key issues of our times. There's nothing more healing and nothing more therapeutic and nothing more needed than for people to have access and use of land. Now, I think I lost my thread there. What did I say a second ago? Test, everybody, a quick test. Where was I up to? Private and public, that's right, because it's a bit of a tricky one. So, when you're, say you get your land and you stick a dwelling up on it, where it doesn't matter whether it's a yurt, a geodome or whatever, and you want to live there, it's your land, you've bought it. Pretty soon the council's going to turn up and say, can you give us a layout for that? Can you tell us where the bedrooms are, where the toilets are and all the rest of it? And you're like, wait a minute, this is my private home. And they're like, no, sorry, planning regs, TCPA Act, blah, 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 you need to tell us. Now, what's interesting is that we really don't have to tell them, okay? Because it is private, and private still does mean private. It really does. And as long as you are not harming anybody, depriving anybody of liberty, injuring anybody, anything like that, then private can and should still mean private. And I think the trickiest thing that was played was to move the line of what private means. So, you know, and I think it's down to greedy people. I think it's down to corrupt businessmen who basically were trying to say what they were doing was private, but actually it wasn't. It was business. And I think at some point the state or government got to the stage where it's like, oh, well, you're all bloody at it, right? That's it. That's the end of private. Everything's corporatized now. You have to tell us everything. Everything is subject to statutory jurisdiction. And that was it. All of a sudden, you had to declare everything. But I want you all to think of something, you know, just ponder this as I prepare to finish, and that is, show me the law or the statute that says a government should be party to every action, asset, or deed of the people. Because there isn't one. So why is it our government is behaving as if they are party to those things? And this is where the privacy is gone, you know, or it's certainly disappearing rapidly. So what we're trying to do with the People's Public Trust is redefine what private means and draw that line again so that we can have a freedom on our land and a freedom to interact privately between each other without requiring to account for ourselves. And so we're looking to kind of use the trust to help people protect their assets and to protect their family if it comes down to that, but it shouldn't really come down to that. But ideally, we want to use it to recognize the trust that we all place in each other when it comes to land. Because we trust each other. You know, if one of you guys said, you know, I'm going to buy that land over there, well, I'm going to trust you not to damage it and pollute it and make it less usable and use all sorts of obnoxious, horrible chemicals on it. Yeah? That, I think we could say that that would be a pretty general trust that most people would have of each other in the use of land that we are all shared custodians of, because that is a fact. You know, we are indeed all shared custodians of it. So what we're trying to do with the trust to get around planning is to, rather than tell councils what people are going to do, we'd rather set up a trust that says what they're not going to do. Yeah? And it's to allow us to try and buy us the space to get to back the steamroller off a bit, to give us the freedom to experiment, because we're still experimenting with all of this stuff. People need the freedom to experiment with their use of land, with the structures they want to live in, and the standards that they want to live to, and that should not be subject to outside measurement unless it's causing harm. And I don't think that's, you know, that's not too out there, is it? Seems like a reasonable enough idea. So what we're doing with that's what we're trying to do at the moment with our land cases. So as you can see, there's a few sort of case types we're getting involved in. But the final thing is that we're not actually launched yet. So with these are you're just one of a number of increasing groups which have started to hear about the work of the trust and what we're up to. But we're going for a formal launch probably early next year, where we're looking to turn up at as many council and police officers as possible to let them know that we're here, and to just say, hello, we're watching you watching us, and to have, you know, have you all seen these bullying at work posters? You know, where it says, you know, have you seen bullying? Have you seen people doing this? We want to have that for corruption and immature managers and things like that. And to say, you know, you come across this, give us a call. Trust matters at peoplespublictrust.com, which is exactly what it is. So we're aiming for that launch date, but to be able to take the kind of representative action that I would like us to take, because, you know, if we start going after every individual Bobby who's a problem or every individual council worker, we're going to be at this for years. And I don't want to be at this for years. You know, I want to be living with my family, sorting some land out and all the rest of it, and getting on with my other events, which I'd rather be doing. This is just a sideline kind of fun game for me, really. It's just that because people were so worried about their bills and the government, they weren't coming to my other events. It's like, okay, we'll deal with that first then, and then we'll get on to the good stuff. So I'd really like to see us get this nailed up and sorted out in a couple of years. And to do that, we really need to escalate the action. So we're planning a launch rally. And I'd really invite anybody here who's interested to come and add your name to the mailing list if it's something you'd like to get involved in, because we do need people in every area, or as many areas as possible, but also for our rally. So I don't like traditional demonstrations because they're too permissive. It's about people saying, we want to protest. Can you tell us where we can do it, please? You know, and then you have things like kettling, you have things like crowd psychology, which then lowers the tone of the whole thing, but then you also have crowd control, which then is a very kind of not very nice thing in my opinion. So I'd really gone off demonstrations because I didn't see them as achieving much. It was good venting for people to go along and say, yeah, backslapping, yeah, we're protesting, brilliant. And so that lowers the boiling pot for a while and they all go home. I'm not a massive fan of it, but I had an idea when I was, funnily enough, decorating my daughter's bedroom a number of months ago. And I was sitting there drawing these lines on her wall as I was doing two-tone effect. And I realised that everything that we're doing is in the free man movement, and indeed at events like this, is that we are drawing a line. Okay, we're drawing a line to say what it is we want and what it is we don't want. And we're all involved in this process all the time in things, is, you know, especially when you're being involved in any form of activism or green work or anything, is that you're drawing a line. And as I was sitting there drawing this line, it made me think about, I wish I had a ruler to paint this line because it'd be quicker than me doing it by hand. And then I thought, that's a bit funny, isn't it? That, you know, what is a ruler for? A ruler is the one that measures things. And a ruler is used to draw a line. So when we think about our rulers that we have out there in the world, what do you think of the measure they're setting in relation to you? Is that a measure that matches your sort of attitude and your opinion, and the line that they're drawing in the direction that it's in? Is that one that you resonate with? Because if not, what we're looking to do early next year is we're going to draw a line of people. A very large line, hopefully, in as many places as possible, or just one large line. What's great about a line is that it is organised. It's not a rabble. It's not subject to crowd control because it's not a crowd. Okay? It's a very, very peaceful thing to do, but it is phenomenally powerful. We've tested this at a few festival events, and it's amazing to get everybody to join an incredible line. And we wanted the people to join in the line to say that they've had enough. And then off the back of that, hopefully we will have enough support off the back of the line to be able to take the sort of big-scale representative actions that need to be taken for us to tidy this sort of mess up and do the Icelandic thing and tell them where to go, you know, because, and that's just one issue, is the financial one. There's obviously many, many issues that can't be addressed at a high level unless enough of us get on board. And so I'm kind of offering you all the People's Public Trust as a tool to use for that effect. And we have a number of people on board, but we can't do it without more people. And, you know, and what I'm saying is, yeah, we can all do our individual thing, and I think, you know, we need that. Everybody, you know, the new community and the future is very much about independent, autonomous people coming together to cooperate. You know, cooperate doesn't mean doing the same thing. It means working side by side to a, you know, to a common goal or whatever. And so, I think I lost my thread there again. So I do apologise. I looked into the light there and it completely blinded my brain. Yeah, so early next year we want to draw a line and take that representative action at as high a level as possible. So if that's something that resonates with you, and if it's something that's interests you, or you want to find out a bit more about what the Trust is doing, then you can visit peoplespublictrust.com, Or you can come and sign up just now and give us your email and your name if that's all right, and we can let you know when things are happening. And what we're looking at doing is having observers in towns all over the country where they're just watching and, you know, recording, and if new word comes to them of problem people or problem situations, then to come and let us know, because we've got a number of very, very skilled, very well researched and very well practiced people at some of this stuff who want to go out and take the front line, you know, but they can't do it without the people behind them who are saying, yeah, you know, we want you to go and take that action, because otherwise, why should they? You know, and obviously because we all know it can't be effective without enough support. So I know I've meandered around a little in this talk, but I hope I've managed to get across the spirit of what we're trying to do with the People's Public Trust, but also to get across some of the power of language and the power of the language that's in there. It's not just about the whole legalese stuff like those of you who may have looked into the sovereign movement is about. It really is about the stuff that we're seeing every day. There is so much buried in it that we do not have to look very far. We really don't. So I think to wrap up, I'm just going to say, does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I refused to fill in my census. And
Yes.
threatening me saying it's against the law. I mean, isn't this the council anticipating something about what you're talking about? About they're actually trying to reclaim your identity by getting you to fill in the census, and then effectively they know where you live then, and you admit to your age and everything else, and so they're enforcing themselves to be able to go in and counteract what you're trying to say.
Yes, that's right. That's right. This has been, I mean, it was already well known that the most recent census was the most invasive census that has ever come across. You know, there's never been one that has asked as many questions. And yes, it is part of the erosion of privacy, but also the massive cataloguing, isn't it? It's that mass database building. I mean, any of those of you who looked into the census may have known that Lockheed Martin were involved in some of the data capture. Now, Lockheed Martin are one of the largest weapons manufacturers in the world, but for the last 5 to 10 years, their CEO has stated that their primary interest is intelligence. It's intelligence gathering. And really, if you give them any access to the UK Census database, how can you trust them? So, yeah, I didn't fill in my census form either, but I didn't really get any trouble about it. And you're right, they do say it's against the law, but it's not. It's against statute. It's not against any law. And the other one you'll get is, have any of you had the form through to renew your photocard driving licence where they're also threatening you with a £1,000 fine? Have you not had that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I had that, and I wrote back to them saying, well, show me the law that says I need to, I need to renew my driver's licence every 10 years, because it's not there. But I said, I'll be happy to do so, but it'll cost you £90 because I've got to go out and get a picture taken and do all of this and blah, 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 and you appear to be asking me to perform some of your administration, so pay the bill, and I'm happy to do it.
Given the heads up. Now they're asking.
Yeah.
They're asking for the new license. They won't give you insurance without it.
Really? That's very interesting. This is where there's the net is closing in, as it were. ANPR is part of that as well, where all the databases are being merged. And in fact, the letter I got from the DVLA specifically said on it, this isn't the address we have on file, but we got this address from one of our commercial partners. And so we're writing to you here about this. And obviously they're looking to say, identify where everybody's at. You know, they want to pin down where everybody's at, and also where are they from. You know, I noticed that on the census as well. They wanted to know that even if you had somebody staying overnight on that date in March, they wanted to know where they were from and all this sort of stuff.
They're even asking you if you're sleeping with the person that you're sharing a house with, effectively.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. The room allocations, all this sort of stuff, and the relationship between them. Yeah. It's very invasive, and yes, very, very much part of the erosion of privacy. That's why I didn't fill it in.
You're also now wanting to stop you insure, if you don't insure your car, they're wanting you to be able to be off the road, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Car insurance is a bit of a funny one for me, because I know that a lot of free men have gone down immediately the driving route, because obviously it's one of the things that hurts the most in the old pocket, isn't it? Because you're not only hit at the pump, you're hit at the MOT, you're hit at the tax, you're hit with the insurance. It's a massively expensive thing to keep vehicles on the road, and especially some of the vehicles that are here. People know, you've got to do work on your vehicle as well. But I do have a bit of a difficulty with challenging some of the driving stuff, not because I don't agree with it in principle, but because I don't think many of the free men who get into not paying their insurance and deregistering their cars and things like that, I don't think they've cottoned on to the two key hallmarks that go with the Freeman and Sovereignty movement, and those two hallmarks are honour and responsibility. Because the whole point of being a ward of the state is because you're irresponsible and you're not honourable, so you need to have everything provided for you. You know, and this is where the providence of public service comes from. It's saying, well, you know, you're all children of the state, and you know, we'll look after you and blah blah blah. But there's a price, and you're just not told what the price is. But when it comes to driving, what I say to free men who don't want to insure and they don't want to tax and all the rest of it, all I want to say to them is, well, okay, just say something happens, okay? I know you're a careful driver, I know you do your best and all the rest of it, but just say it does. Just say, you know, a kid runs out in front of a car or whatever. Are you going to scrape the parts up? Are you going to get the cars taken off the road? Are you really? Have you got the money to back it up? Because that's taking responsibility. And if you're not prepared to do that, then I say pay your insurance, because that will take care of all of that for you. Sorry? Not the tax. Forget the tax. Forget the MOT as well. You know.
What I find difficult about this is just the level of control in there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because they dictate the amount that the insurance. Yeah. That's the issue. No, I agree. That's a massive issue.
It's a symbol. It's a symbol of that.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was interrupting.
No.
I was wondering, has anybody else come across, because I've heard now a few people mentioning quite confidently, and I've been looking for details, people talking about the possibility of using some kind of public liability insurance instead of traditional motor insurance.
There is absolutely no reason why you can't do that. It is perfectly theoretically possible. There's lots of ways you can cover you. You can actually bond yourself. You can just write a bond. Those of you that have got into bond writing, you can write a bond, and that does cover you as long as you can back the bond up. And in fact, there's no police car or bike in the country is insured. None of them are. They're just bonded. And I think to get away with the bonding, you only need to have like 40 grand in the bank.
How would you back the bond up if we're bankrupt?
Yeah, that's it. It's all fudging, isn't it? Yeah, that's a very good point. Nicely thrown in there. Yeah, you can't back the bond up when you're bankrupt. That's absolutely true. It scuppers the whole game then, isn't it? Next question.
Said that one of the things we'd like to have a go at is, you know, when you put up a structure to live in on your own patch of land, which isn't harming anybody.
Yes.
We want to say, look, you've got no right to come in and measure it and look at it.
Yeah.
Because it's not causing anybody any trouble.
Absolutely, and it's my land. Yeah.
Are we getting close to the point where we can look at things which clearly are causing trouble and start bringing them in? Because obviously, it's like, I'm aware that lots of alternative therapists at the moment are coming under the hammer by the Advertising Standards Authority for using words like heal and symptom and cure and loads of words.
And remedy,
Even though probably these remedies have never done anybody any harm.
Yeah.
Whereas, lots of remedies that are causing loads and loads of harm are not being questioned. So I'm looking at, are we going to be able to go the other way?
We should be able to, but the only way we can do it really is by, I suppose it's exactly the same as what the other side do, isn't it? And that is you do a study. And you publish the findings of a study, because then it's down to them to disprove it. I went to Edinburgh University. I only went for 1 year. I dropped out after that. But I went to a seminar in that first year that's still stuck with me now. And I was studying psychology, and there was this 70-odd-year-old psychologist there. I mean, he was well respected in the field. I do him a disservice remembering his name. But he was giving a talk about how he had done a well-funded study in 5 countries and 100,000 people that said smoking did not cause cardiovascular disease or other associated illnesses. And there was medical doctors in the room absolutely freaking out, going, "We're going to have you, you're going to get disbarred, blah, blah, blah." He's like, "I'm 70 whatever years old. I've been doing this stuff my whole life, and what I'm doing is just sharing with you my research. You're just reacting from what you've been drip-fed." And basically what he'd managed to show was that actually what they found was that people who smoked were more prone to stress. And actually what they found was that people who suffered from stress quite a lot had the same percentage of incidence of these particular disease types as smokers did. And it was factually proven there. Has anybody heard about that study here? I didn't think so. Yeah.
So if we brought such studies to attention,
exactly.
Trust,
yes.
Because peer review obviously holds things down.
It does.
And we need another way of...
Exactly. Well, this is the point. I invite people to think about how the public trust can be used, because we've got we're already using it in a number of different ways. But this is the point. It's the people's trust. It's for you guys to use. All it is an umbrella that I've created but it's been strategically created to be able to move freely around jurisdictions with private powers. And that's something we've not had up until now. And obviously we're still testing the powers of that, but the more of us who get behind it and get involved, the more powerful it'll become. And it really does have the potential to change things quite a lot. I started this off just by literally, I had my little People's Public Trust Master ID badge that I made up myself and stuck that on and had myself a clipboard.
That's a good idea, you can't do that.
I had my little clipboard with the logo and observer notes on it, and as an individual being observed, and I used to go into courts with people and just be visible. And I wouldn't do anything or say anything. I would just look on and scribble things. And do you know what? The behavioral change was absolutely incredible across the board, every single time we've done it. And that, to me, shows the potential power of this work, that just by simply turning up with a badge and a clipboard, all of a sudden everybody's nice as pie, when before, so like one example was, 12 of us were going into a magistrate's court, I was at the back intentionally, as they were going in, everybody's like, there's no, we can't have you, and they're like, well, this is a public court, you know, we should come in here, you know, oh, we've not got enough seats or whatever. And all I did was just move out, and it was like, okay, a little note. She says, I'll be back in a minute, because in courts, everybody looks at badges, okay? They really do. They all look at anybody's, they want to know who's there. They want to know who's there, because they will change their behaviour based on it. So off she disappeared into the court and came back a minute later. All of a sudden, everybody's best friend, come on in, everybody, we can squeeze you all in. And we went in, and there was more than 12 seats there in the first place. They were just trying to keep everybody out because they're trying to control, they're trying to, you know, move the steamroller over individuals. They want people to feel small and powerless and helpless and all the rest of it, and they'll try and stand in the way of that. Whereas this very, very small application showed how it can be different. And we've since used it in different ways with councils, with courts, things like that, with mixed success, I might add, because, you know, you're always up against and, you know, the individual psychology, but it's certainly something that has the potential to be absolutely mind-blowingly transformational for this country. And I don't say that lightly, I really don't, but it can't happen without more and more people on board. So are there any other questions before I... Yes?
Sorry guys, we're going to have to cut it.
Yeah, there is another talk.
Are you on again later in the weekend?
Yes.
When are you on?
We're 15 minutes behind
Oh.
time.
Tell them when you're on again.
Freeman.
Let's have this one anyway, and then we
Very quickly,
Okay,
yeah.
one last question.
Okay, well, it's just something I just wanted to ask if you could help, really.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've been trying to fight it on my own at the moment, and it's what the councils all over the country, but in particular I know in London, have done with regard to council tenants and their rents. They put them up in places 15, 17%, trying to oust them out, so that it's like segregating society, basically.
Yeah.
Especially where they think the land isn't worth. They're doing regeneration projects.
Yes.
You know, it's just an absolute mess.
Yes.
And we have no power. And I've done everything I can.
Perfect. Come and sign up and be a public trust operative and use the trust to do it. That's exactly the sort of thing it's for. What we have to do, though, is talk about the strategy there. I am going to wrap up. I'm on again every day this week, basically, but the other workshops I'm doing are about my own self-development stuff, but there is going to be a discussion forum here on Saturday at 5:30. No? Sorry?
We have a Freeman forum in the Ariga space, which is just behind, the lovely dome behind.
Yeah.
Darren's going to be on in the Ariga space another 3 times this weekend. So
Yeah. Please do come and see me. Yeah, and if you...
questions you've got, there's Michael of Benicia, who's Freeman Zeitgeist from freetheplanet.net. He's coming tomorrow night, hopefully, and be on 3 times over the weekend.
Also,
he's amazing. John Whittrick's on tomorrow as well.
Yeah, get out of debt free.
Also, most of us, I mean, we're certainly staying here and stuff, so
Yeah,
we'll come and
all be
talk to us.
around.
Yeah, come and talk to us at any time. I'm just behind there. Finally, I'll say many thanks for your attention. I will say that if you liked some of the elements of this talk and where it was coming from in terms of the power of the language and whatnot, that really is the very tip of the iceberg. Please do come along and check out some of my other events, which are much more about that stuff, and I've got nothing to do with law or Freeman or anything like that. It's very much about your personal awareness and personal empowerment. Please do come along. Mailing list here if people want to come up and sign up for the trust. Thank you all very much for your kind attention. And sorry, Nathan, for overrunning.
Thank you, Darren. We've got Nathan Lewis Williams on next, and he's going to be talking about alignment with the Glasgow Centre 2012. So I urge you all to stay.
I'll be around for that.
Yeah.
Yes, please do. Let me just legislation against green protesters and, you know, the climate camp and things like that. And people aren't aware that anything that that they construe to influence government can be construed to be terrorism, and it's something that we really have to watch out for, because it's part of, or seems to be part of, an ever-enclosing net which is looking to criminalise people for their everyday activity. The criminalisation of it is really all about cash. It's to try and get cash out of people, and we're going to have a look a little bit tonight as to what that's all about, but not too much. But I would invite people to go and watch films such as Money is Debt and other related ones on the whole idea of what economy is and how money works, because it's another part of the illusion that surrounds us, and a very powerful part because of how much people measure their decisions and their actions based on their financial capacity. So it's a very, very powerful thing. Now, can I just get a sort of a show of hands as to how many people are familiar with the whole Freeman or Sovereign movement in any way at all? So most of you, but there's a few that aren't. Okay, I'll go into some of the basic principles just so you've got your head around it. So if we are indeed all born in a state of divine mandate and sovereignty and feeling fully empowered, with an equal right to make decisions as anybody else on the planet, then how is it that we get swept into this hierarchy where we find ourselves at the bottom of the pile? How does this actually happen? Because as this chap who wrote When I Say No, I Feel Guilty says, when did you sign the contract that put you in that position? Because you didn't, did you? Now, the Freeman movement has been very much about researching how it is that the state manages to enforce its statutes upon us seemingly without our consent. Now, the reality is that upon investigation, that it is actually all consent-based. Our whole system of governance is based on consent, because if it wasn't, it would be slavery. And this is the big question that is being asked now. There's a really interesting thing that the Abolition of Slavery Act has actually been abolished. Which, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Green Gathering 2011. It's nice to see it back, yay! Brilliant. My name's Darren Deojee, and I'm doing quite a few events this weekend, but the one tonight is about the People's Public Trust, which most of you will not have a clue what that is at the moment, but hopefully by the end of it you'll see that it's something quite interesting and something valuable that we can all take from and use. I can't really do this talk or this introduction without talking about the Freeman and Sovereign movement in some way, even though we're going to discover that it is a bit of a dead-end street. And for those of you that don't know anything about the Freeman and Sovereign movement, we'll talk about it a bit as we go along. But I want to start tonight talking about a book I read many years ago that I think made a really important point for all of us. And it was a book called When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. And so if everyone thinks about that for a moment, when I say no, I feel guilty. And it was a book about assertiveness. And it was written by a guy who was sent by the American Army to train, not the Army, sorry, maybe he was, but he was sent by the Americans to help train the Peace Corps over in Vietnam. And he had a bit of a problem with the young Americans who went over there, and that is none of them could assert themselves. And he started to explore with them where all this came from. And he started to ask them, you know, where was the contract you signed that said you had to answer a question every time somebody asked it? When somebody asks for your name or your date of birth or where you're going or things like that, where do we get this sense of obligation to give answers or to do what others say? And he found that there was a real problem with these young Americans in feeling any sense of authority and empowerment in their roles or in what they were doing. And I think it's a very relevant point for all of us, and especially those of you who are into your Freeman stuff, you'll be very aware that contract is a big issue. But there was another point that he made in that book that I think is even more important, and he talks about the worst thing that can happen to a species. And he says the worst thing that can happen to a species is that it becomes domesticated. And that is where its offspring are born with their spirits broken and with their desire to explore and be adventurous and be exuberant cracked out of them. And he was commenting back in the late 60s that he was extremely worried that humanity was on the verge of domestication, and absolutely terrified. And I really resonated with that. That meant a lot to me. And I think there's real evidence of this idea of domestication turning up in our cultures, especially in our urban environments, where by the time people have made it through state education, they are indeed domesticated. They're quite cowed. They won't say anything back to authority. They will quite happily answer all questions and fill in all forms without realising what the implications of those things are. And the free man movement, for those of you that don't know anything about it, is very much about understanding what the implications of those things are. It's called the free man or sovereign movement because it recognises the fact that we are all born free. We're all born with a sovereignty in our consciousness, with a divine mandate and a divine right to be here, to take up our space, to have the right to our opinions and our beliefs and our practices as long as they're not hurting anybody else. And this is really held in essence in our common law. So the common law is something that is spread mainly around, a lot of Europe and North America and the North American continent. And you can sum it up in three basic principles, which is, if you're not affecting anybody's liberty, property, or causing injury, then you're not actually committing a crime, because nobody's being harmed. Now, that's an interesting contrast to the situation we find ourselves in, which is where more and more unharmful activities, or unharmful to anybody else anyway, are being criminalised. And this is something which has really been accelerated with the birth of the Criminal Justice Act and other such bill, the Terrorism Act, things like that. I mean, a lot of people don't realise that under the Terrorism Act, the definition of terrorism is any act which seeks to influence government. Now that really deserves a lot of thought, because this is how they're managing to use terrorism, like being in and out of courts with people all over the country at various talks and meets, listening to other people and their experiences. And we really are in the belly of the beast here, and we are really up against some of the oldest structures of governance and I suppose community control on the planet. So it means we've got our work cut out for us. Now, registration is something that we all take as a normal thing. You register on websites, you register for this, you register for that. But it's actually a term that comes from Admiralty, which is a type of law, the law of the sea. And in Admiralty, when a captain used to register a ship at the harbour, it would essentially be handing over temporary custodianship to the harbour master, because the captain was going to be off on the land for a while. Now, that hasn't actually changed. When your parents registered you, there wasn't a way handing over temporary custodianship or inviting an element of custodianship to the state over you. And this is where the power of the state to come and take children from their parents, or to demand that you go to school, or to demand that you have to do X, Y, and Z, or try to get you to have certain vaccines. It's all actually done off the back of the registration document. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later when we get onto the subject of title. Now, the final element that you really need to get in terms of understanding the free man movement, just as a skeleton for us to move forward onto the real meat of tonight's talk, is the idea of what's called the legal fiction, or the legal person. Now, the legal person is the Mr., the Mrs., or the Miss. It's the title that was given to you. So it's that name that you see that appears in all capitals on envelopes or documents that come through. That is referring to essentially a fictitious entity. It's not actually referring to you, the real human being, because in truth the state can't actually act upon you, the real human being. They can only act upon this fictitious entity. I think it's quite funny. Well, it's not abolished, it's been repealed as one of the many acts that were being repealed under the guise of the fact that it wasn't needed anymore. But I'm not quite so sure that was the overall motive for it, but we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. Now, one of the major premises of the Freeman and Sovereign movement is that all the things that you normally think of as law are not actually laws. They are things which are given the force of law by a government, and that is all the acts of Parliament. So they're actually called statutes. So you may have heard that term. Has everybody heard it? Yeah? So you hear of statutory authority and statutory this and statutory that. These are all under the guise of being law, but they're not. They are legal. Okay? And the reason we have the different words for legal and lawful is because they're different things. So legal in the world of legality and the world of statutes is one law, which is all under, I suppose you could think of it as a corporate sort of jurisdiction, or a corporatized jurisdiction. But then you have the real laws, that are all the ones which don't have act after the title. So things like the Bill of Rights or the Magna Carta, these things just have a year after them. And these are the things which are the true laws, which operate on a common law basis. Now, the whole research process on how the state has managed to act upon us as sovereign beings has been going on for a number of years now. Mainly it started off in America and Canada and then moved over to this country. But I think we've got it a bit tougher here because the Americans and the Canadians have more recent documents like the American Constitution which recognise their rights and their powers. We don't really have anything like that. The Magna Carta is the closest thing we have, but it doesn't really recognise the sort of power that we're talking about here. But the research has basically taken us to the point of understanding what registration is about. Now, registration is a bit of a tricky thing, and I don't want to get too technical on all the legal stuff because it's a bit of a black hole, and I do believe that it's a bit of a smokescreen, and that's why I don't think it's worth delving into too much. And I say this from the voice of experience. I've been doing this stuff for a couple of years now.